Hello everyone, and welcome to History Live. I'm Roberto Medina. Today, I want to share the story of my favorite president, Ulysses S. Grant. He is often remembered for leading Lincoln's armies, but his true legacy lies in his relentless fight to preserve the Union and protect his family until the very end. Using Grant's own memoirs from the Library of Congress, we're going to look at the man behind the uniform. I hope you enjoy it.
I never had a turn for the military. Growing up in Ohio, my joys were found in the fields and with horses, not in the precision of the drill. When my father informed me that he had secured an appointment for me at West Point, my heart sank. I told him I would not go, but he replied that he thought I would. And in our house, that was the end of the matter. I arrived at the academy hoping for a bill to pass in Congress that would abolish the institution, sparing me a career I did not want. I was a boy who preferred the company of a good steed to the company of soldiers. Yet, as I looked at the flag and the discipline of the place, a sense of duty began to take root, however unwillingly. I did not seek glory. I only sought to finish my term and return to a quiet life. The Mexican War was my true education, though I always considered it one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker one. Under General Zachary Taylor at Monterey, I learned that a commander's presence on the field is worth more than any manual of arms. I remember the smell of the chaparral and the whistling of musket balls that seemed to come from every direction. I served as a quartermaster, but I could not stay in the rear when the fighting commenced. I found myself leading a charge through the streets, dodging snipers from the rooftops to find ammunition for my men. It was here I saw the faces of the men I would later fight with and against. I learned that war is a terrible thing, but if it is to be done, it must be pursued with a singular, relentless purpose. After the glory of Mexico came the long, stagnant years of peace that nearly broke me. I resigned my commission in the West, far from my wife Julia and our children. I returned to Missouri to find myself a man of 32 with no profession but the sword. I cleared land, built a log cabin I named Hardscrabble, and tried to wring a living from the soil. I hauled wood into St. Louis to sell on street corners, wearing my old faded army overcoat to keep out the chill. I saw former comrades pass me by, their polished buttons a sharp contrast to my muddy boots. Many looked at me with pity, seeing a man who had failed at everything. But those years of poverty taught me a patience and a humility that the academy never could. I was being forged in a different kind of fire. When the news of Fort Sumter reached us in Galena, the world changed overnight. I was working in my father's leather store, surrounded by the smell of hides and the quiet of a clerk's life. But when the president called for volunteers, I knew my place. I did not care for rank or title. I only knew that I had been educated at the government's expense and was now bound to pay that debt. I helped organize the local companies, teaching raw farm boys how to stand and march. There was a sense of solemnity in the air, a realization that the Union was tearing itself apart. I wrote to the Adjutant General offering my services, but received no reply. I did not wait for an invitation. I took command of the 21st Illinois, a rowdy, undisciplined lot, and told them that we had work to do. The winter at Fort Donelson was a test of endurance. The ground was frozen, and the men shivered in the trenches without fires, fearing the enemy's marksmanship. When the Confederate generals realized they were trapped, my old friend Simon Buckner sent a message asking for terms of capitulation. I did not hesitate. I sat in a cold farmhouse and wrote the words that would define my reputation. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. It was not out of cruelty that I wrote this, but out of the knowledge that any delay would only cost more lives. Buckner called the terms ungenerous, but he surrendered. For the first time, the North had a victory to celebrate, and the people began to hope that the rebellion could be broken. Shiloh was a revelation of the true nature of this conflict. On that first morning in Tennessee, the woods erupted in a storm of lead that caught us unprepared. I spent the day riding from point to point, trying to hold a line that seemed destined to snap. By nightfall, we were pushed back to the river, and a torrential rain began to fall. I sought shelter under a tree, my injured leg throbbing, watching the wounded crawl through the mud. General Sherman came to me in the darkness, looking for a sign of retreat. He said, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" I bit down on my cigar and replied, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though." We did lick them, but the cost was so great that I realized the South would never be reasoned back into the Union. They would have to be conquered. On the morning of April 9th, I received the note I had been waiting for. I met General Lee at the McLean House, a small brick home in a quiet village. I arrived in my rough, mud-spattered field uniform, while he was dressed in full finery with a jeweled sword at his side. We talked for a few moments about our old days in Mexico, two men who had grown old in the service of different causes. When it came time to write the terms, I thought only of peace. I allowed the officers to keep their sidearms, and the men to take their horses home for the spring plowing. As Lee rode away, the Union batteries began to fire a salute in celebration. I ordered them to stop. The rebels were our countrymen again, and the best way to show our joy was to begin the work of healing. I moved from the command of armies to the command of a nation still bleeding from its wounds. The presidency was a duty I did not seek, yet I felt compelled to protect the peace we had won on the battlefield. I stood on the portico of the Capitol and watched the face of the country change. My greatest struggle was not against a foreign power, but against the shadows of the old order that sought to deny the freedmen their rights. I signed the Enforcement Acts to break the power of the Ku Klux Klan and championed the 15th Amendment, believing that the ballot was the only true shield for the oppressed. The air in Washington was thick with scandal and political intrigue, far removed from the clarity of the camp. But I held to one truth, that the Union must not only be preserved, but made just for all its citizens. In the twilight of my life, I found myself engaged in my most desperate campaign. After being swindled into financial ruin, I faced a new enemy, a cancer that stole my voice and withered my strength. I moved to a small cottage at Mount McGregor, determined to finish these memoirs before the end came. With a pencil in my trembling hand and my throat wrapped in bandages, I raced against the clock to ensure that Julia would not be left in poverty. My friend Mark Twain stood by me, encouraging every page. Every word I wrote was a victory over the pain. I realized then that a man's character is not measured by his rank, but by how he faces his final hour. I finished the last chapter just days before the silence took me, grateful that I had lived to tell the story of the men who saved the Union.
I grew up in Ohio
And went to West Point.
Even though I had no real desire for a life in the military.
In the Mexican War, I learned how to move an army and saw the terrible reality of the battlefield for the first time. At Shiloh, I held my lines against a sudden Confederate attack
and fought back until we finally claimed the field.
I laid siege to Vicksburg for months until it fell.
Finally splitting the Confederacy along the great Mississippi River.
President Lincoln gave me command of all Union forces, trusting me to bring this long and painful rebellion to its end. I led my men into the tangled woods of the wilderness, determined never to turn back from General Lee's army.
Outside Petersburg, I dug in for a long winter.
I met General Lee at Appomattox to end the war, offering terms that allowed his men to go home in peace.
As president, I fought to protect the rights of the newly freed and struggled to heal a nation still deeply scarred by war.
In my final days, I raced against death to write my story, hoping to provide for my family one last time.